Our next author this morning is Dr. Guido Hülsmann. Dr. Hülsmann is a professor of economics at the University of Angers in France, and he'll be talking to us this morning about his new book, The Ethics of Money Production. Guido?
The Ethics of Money Production is a concise exposition of the principles of money and banking. From an Austrian point of view, the book is organized in three parts. First part deals with the natural production of money, so in a free market setting. The second part deals with inflation, various forms of infringements of property rights leading to inflation. And the third part is an application of this type of analysis that is being developed to an analysis of the history of monetary systems in the past 300 years. So it's a very concise exposition and down to the present day. The background of the book was that I was being asked by the Accent Institute about 6 years ago to write a book on money and morals, or monetary policy and morals, and which I sent out to do. I was very glad to have this opportunity because I intended to write a book of this sort for some time. And then it got a little bit out of hand. So it was very interesting, as Lou said, very interesting. And you go on writing and on. And eventually it was the double of the size that was initially planned. So they wouldn't anymore publish me unless I cut down all the interesting things that I thought were in the book. So they just wanted me to basically restate those things that were already in the literature for their audience. And I was not happy with this, so we had to separate our paths. And I eventually published it with a very decent publisher, which is the Mises Institute. I'm happy for this, and they put it online, so we can read the book online. And it's actually not even $1, right? It's zero. It's a very handy, nice book, very beautifully made. It's a layout by Kathy White. She does most of the layouts here for the Mises Institute. It's particularly beautiful. So what you see here is an excerpt from a German medieval law book. In those days, there were comics. Okay, law books were comics, not actually commented. So what we have here is so from the 13th century, from the Sachsen Spiegel. The scene where it says that render to Caesar upon what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. So God is in the middle, Jesus, and we have to the left hand the citizen, or should we say subject, that is being lectured. And to the right hand there is the emperor. And it's a very nice setting because nobody regards looks at the emperor. Yeah, so good old times. Yeah. So. The book is dedicated to Hans Sennholz, because Sennholz was one of the only major Austrian writer, monetary economist, who tried to integrate Austrian analysis with Christian teaching, a Christian perspective. And that's exactly what the book is doing as well, or trying to doing as well. So I'm not only arguing the standard 3 Austrian lines on our current monetary system, which are, you do not need it because there is a private alternative. You can run a monetary system on a completely private basis that is only on the principle of private property and contracts that are implied. So there can be competitive production of money, can be a competitive production of banking services and so on. We don't need a systemic risk authority, and we don't need a central bank and these other things. Second, monetary interventions do not provide any service. That is, the only service, more precisely, that they do provide is to create a redistribution of resources to the benefit of certain privileged groups and to the detriments of the rest of society. But apart from this, there are no there's no value added, so to say, of monetary policy. And the third line would be that not only does monetary policy or monetary interventions do not create a value added, do not promote the common good, but they rather create positive harm. And this comes in particular in two forms. One is the redistribution, which is brings about disruptive effects within society. And the second one is the intertemporal disequilibria that are analyzed in Austrian business cycle theory. So we have these three standard lines, and then a fourth point that is a little less stressed in typical Austrian text, which is that these interventions are immoral. They are immoral on two accounts. First of all, they are intrinsically immoral because they, all of them are based on or imply violations of property rights. And what I do in the second part of my book is to go into detail analyzing the various ways in which governments violate property rights by setting up legal rules under which money production takes place that involve the violation of property rights, monopoly, for example, and legal tender laws which override choices by market participants. And the second account on which it is immoral is indeed that it's contrary to the common good. So it creates positive harm. It does not promote production and consumption within the economy, but diminishes those things. Utilitarian arguments play a central role, and therefore economic science has come to play the elevated role it has come to play for more than 200 years, and it therefore plays a very big role within the argument of the book. But it's not all that there is to it, so there's more. Now, what are the objectives, the particular objectives that I set myself in writing this book? Because now you might think, well, what's the point of buying this other book, Austrian book on monetary economics, because Mises seems to have said pretty much the same thing, Rothbard as well, and others as well, Huerta de Soto, Hayek even. And I agree, of course, I didn't even attempt to reinvent the wheel, okay, so there's no absolute new thing here, but there are a couple of new things in that I try to stress in order precisely not to repeat what we find in the standard Austrian text. So 4 or 5 particular features. The first one is that I stress the tradition of Austrian economics, a tradition that reaches way back beyond Karl Menger. Okay, Austrians, the take that Austrians have on questions of monetary policy reaches back to the 14th century and to a very important intellectual of the time, Nicolas Oresme, was a bishop in Caen, or excuse me, a bishop in I forgot it. It'll come back. He was born in Caen, and he was bishop in a place close to this. He was the confessor of the king, okay, and he was the author of the first treatise entirely dedicated to an economic subject, namely the production of money, which is also an inspiration for the title of the book. By the way, the title of the book is kind of funny. It was first planned to be Just Money. It's a play on words. Just money is money that is just, as justice, but it's also just money. It's not something else, right? And then Lou Rockwell, actually, who now, as I've just learned, takes lessons as far as title giving is concerned from Judy Thomason, recommended that I better choose The Ethics of Money Production. I've been very happy with this title, which is, well, therefore, in this tradition, reaching back to Oresme. And Oresme strongly opposed any government meddling with money production. Typical money production of his time was coin making. And so Oresme said, well, once you have created a coin, well, you can just have it run out if nobody needs it anymore. Well, you just can let it drop and produce new coins. But once a coin is there, you shouldn't change it. So you should not debase the coinage in particular. And he rejected all utilitarian justifications of such meddling. And of course, there his argument was not much developed, it was rather primitive, but often just implied. But he clearly was of the opinion that no positive utilitarian contribution could be reached by government meddling with money. And this inspired a long row of thinkers who developed monetary thought in the same tradition. So we have people like Gabriel Biel in the 15th century, we have Ptolemy of Lucca, we have the late scholastics in Salamanca, Juan de Mariana, Azpilicueta. And then we have the whole line of monetary thought that starts in the 18th century with Cantillon, Richard Cantillon, and goes through David Hume and Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and finally reaches the Austrians. So the Austrians are just the hairs, and this is particularly clear in the present day, which virtually everybody else is a kind of a mercantilist or neo-mercantilist. And often they say that they are inspired by Keynes, right? The Keynesian economics, but truly Keynes just warmed up, brought back doctrines that were already known and argued for in the 18th century. So the Austrians are in a long tradition. And this tradition at its beginning emphasized the strong connection between utilitarian considerations and moral considerations, was dropped a little bit in the middle and then brought up in the 20th century again very forcefully by Murray Rothbard. The second objective was to focus on the role of legal rules under which money is being produced. So the title, The Ethics of Money Production, is significant because in Christian literature and in the literature of other religions as well, we find, of course, a huge volume of tracts written on the morals of money. But usually this concerns the way we should use money. That is, how we should spend it, although under which circumstances we are allowed to keep it, according to the Keynesians, never. But there are very few things are actually being said about the ethics of money production, the way money should be produced. And this has, as I try to show, very important consequences on the functioning of the economy. And then, so what I do less in the book is to repeat myself, so you won't find much about fractional reserve banking, you won't find much about central banking, you won't find much about the theory of money prices, so I don't repeat the subjective theory of value. I don't really give just a very brief summary of the pricing, monetary pricing, because all of this was done already in other texts. On the other hand, I stress legal rules, and I stress certain other subjects that have not been dwelt on much by Mises in particular, for example, deflation. So I take a rather positive view of deflation. I think it plays a very important social function. I do not agree on this account with Professor Zenold, my distinguished predecessor on this podium, that deflation is like running over a dead person a second time. I rather think deflation is like taking out the driver out of this cab so that he will not run over the next person. That's the function of deflation, to stay in this image or in this metaphor. So the book is not a treatise on money, but it's much more than an introduction. Right? It's a kind of an intermediate text, let's say, between Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money, which is a wonderful and very, very important introductory text, and on the other hand, Mises' Theory of Money and Credit. A third point that I try to do in this book is to clarify important logical distinctions in monetary analysis. This concerns, for example, the distinction between the production of money and the production of certificates. Now, as I discovered in writing the book, actually we have the category of certification, which is a very general category. It includes both coin making and banking services. So what banks did originally in issuing money certificates, substitutes, it was precisely this, issuing certificates under the form of substitutes. Whereas what we did in former times in coin making was to create certificates that are physically integrated with the monetary object. Then another clarification concerns the origins of fractional reserve banking. So I distinguish three origins of fractional reserve banking. Can come as a perversion of either credit banking or a perversion of deposit banking, but it can also come as a preemptive anticipation of future government interventions, because what governments often did was to just crack down on banks and say, well, this is the famous story about the robber, right, who was being asked, so why did you rob a bank? And you say, well, because that's where the money is. And it's a little bit the same thing with governments. They in the past, they have often robbed banks, have confiscated the deposits, because that's where the money was. Okay, so what banks then did, often in anticipation of such an event, was to go ahead and loan out this money before it could be taken away. Fourth point, and this is rather central and I think really different as compared to the standard Austrian text, is the stress on the pervasive role of moral hazard, which results from monetary interventionism. This is probably the most significant shortcoming in Rothbard's writing on monetary economics, and I consider Rothbard to be the most important Austrian when it comes to monetary analysis. For example, also take his book, Power and the Market. You can rewrite the entire book, write another new Austrian theory of government interventionism by just taking your point of departure in the theory of moral hazard. Plays a very, very important role. Social security systems, of course, various other government interventions, and in monetary policy in particular. Right? That's what we have seen on the markets in our day. Right? There's pervasive moral hazard, which has encouraged and therefore produced, so to say, business practices, business investment strategies that would not otherwise have existed, at least not to this extent. So the banks have run down their cash balances because you don't need any more cash balances. If you have a Federal Reserve, right? So if you want to rob somebody these days, you don't go to a bank. That's where the least money is, right? You go somewhere else, grocery shop or something. And they have also reduced their equity, right? Because the only point of holding equity is to protect yourself against oscillations of your investments, of your assets. Now, if you have a Federal Reserve that stabilizes financial titles on the stock markets and on the bond markets, well, you don't need much equity. So people are running down their equity. And as a consequence, the whole financial markets become very, very fragile, vulnerable. The last point was, well, to bring the Austrian analysis of monetary history up to date. So what we have here is up to date is 2007 approximately. So it's pre-crisis. So there's room for further elaboration, but what I do is to analyze the dynamics of our current fiat money regime and explaining why there is a tendency toward unified fiat money global system. I think the book is a wonderful or useful, well, I shouldn't praise myself too much, it's a useful tool for people who wish to go beyond the beginner state, do not want to stay at an introductory level. And it might be used in classroom with Dr. King, who is using the text at Benedictine College. I'm very happy about this. And so I can only encourage you to consider this, at least as a possibility. If not, you can always hold this up as a sign. If you walk down the streets in protest lines and before the entrance of the Federal Reserve, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. Thank you.